Do you believe in setting boundaries, even if it means losing people?
I never thought my own parents would one day sit across from me at a lawyer's office, smiling like they had finally found the way to put me back in my place. But the morning I opened that certified letter, with its thick stack of documents and the bold headline announcing I was being sued by my own family, I felt something I didn't expect to feel: relief mixed with a kind of dark humor, because instead of breaking me the way they assumed, it showed me just how desperate they had become, and I already knew that their supposed masterstroke was going to be the very thing that ended the grip they thought they had on me. You need to understand, this wasn't a sudden betrayal that came out of nowhere, because my parents had been undermining me for years, first in small ways, like dismissing my career choices as foolish, making jokes in front of relatives that I should find a real job, or rolling their eyes when I spoke about my business ideas, and then in bigger ways, like comparing me constantly to my brother Adam, who in their eyes could do no wrong, even when he bounced from job to job, lived off their money, well into his 30s, and had nothing to show for himself but excuses and handouts. In their world, Adam was the golden child, the one who deserved everything, and I was just the stubborn daughter who dared to want her own path and refused to be grateful for the scraps of approval they tossed my way. When I finally launched my company, a consulting firm I built out of late nights, personal savings, and sheer determination, they didn't congratulate me. They didn't even pretend to be proud. Instead, they acted like I had stolen something from them. Like the fact that I didn't lean on their money or their contacts was some kind of insult to their authority. And for years I told myself I could live with the constant passive-aggressive remarks at family dinners, the backhanded comments about how lucky I was that things worked out, and the pointed digs about how Adam sacrificed so much while I chased dreams. I thought I could ignore it, because my business was thriving and I believed I could build enough distance to make their opinions meaningless. But the day that letter arrived, claiming that I had built my company using family funds that supposedly belonged to all of us, and that therefore they had a legal right to part ownership and profits, I realized they weren't content to just disapprove anymore. They wanted to strip me of the one thing I had built without them, the one thing they couldn't claim credit for or manipulate to favor Adam. And the cruelest part was that they actually thought they would win, because in their minds, I was still their daughter who would fold under pressure, who would beg them to drop the case, who would cry about how unfair it was. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of me, reading the accusations line by line, and instead of the tears they were probably expecting me to shed, I felt a kind of calm spread over me, because I knew something they didn't. I knew that their arrogance, their need to control, and their obsession with proving me wrong would lead them straight into a situation they could not control. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless in the face of their criticism. I felt like I had the upper hand, and it was simply a matter of patience. Of course, the initial meetings with lawyers were brutal, because no one walks into a room where their parents are suing them and feels nothing. Sitting across the table, I watched my mother lean back smugly while my father flipped through his papers with the kind of self-satisfaction you see in people who are certain victory is already theirs. They barely looked at me, except when my father muttered something about how this is what happens when children forget who helped them get where they are, even though they never invested a cent in my company and never once offered anything but criticism. Adam sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, smirking like the spoiled child who had finally been promised the toy he always wanted, and I had to keep my hands clenched in my lap just to stop myself from reacting. The lawyers went back and forth, and my attorney kept waiting for me to chime in, to argue, to defend myself, but I didn't. I sat quietly, I listened, and I let every single accusation be laid on the record. It wasn't that I didn't care or that I had given up, it was that I knew letting them talk, letting them build their fantasy case brick by brick, was the smartest move I could make. Every piece of paper they filed, every boast they made to family friends about how they were going to teach me a lesson, every smug look Adam gave me across the table, all of it was adding weight to the trap they were building for themselves. It wasn't easy, and I won't pretend I didn't go home some nights furious and exhausted, wondering if I was crazy to just sit back and let it all unfold. My friends told me to fight harder, to prove them wrong immediately, to stop letting them smear my name with their accusations. But deep down, I couldn't shake the certainty that waiting, that letting them believe they were winning, was the only way this would end in my favor. So I smiled politely in the meetings, I let my lawyer do the talking, and I nodded when my parents' attorney laid out their so-called evidence. And when we left that room, my lawyer pulled me aside and asked why I wasn't pushing harder, why I was just letting them stack the deck. I looked at him and said, because they think they're playing me. But really, I'm letting them file every paper they want, because the more they think they're winning, the bigger the shock will be when they realize they're not. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't just going to be a fight, it was going to be a reckoning. They thought a lawsuit could break me, but what they didn't realize was that every form they filed, every dollar they spent, every sneer they threw my way, was only bringing them closer to the moment when everything would backfire in the most devastating way possible. Because the truth was, I didn't need to beat them in arguments or paperwork. All I needed to do was wait for the one moment I knew was coming, the moment that would take the smiles off their faces and leave them sitting in silence, wondering how they had ever thought they could destroy me. And that moment started to take shape the very first time I walked into that lawyer's office and chose not to fight back, but to let them file every single paper they could dream up. I wish I could tell you that after the shock of being sued by my own parents, I had a moment of clarity that felt noble or inspirational, but the truth is far messier, because what actually happened was that I sat at my kitchen table, stared at their claims that I had built my company with some kind of family slush fund, felt the old sting of being told I was ungrateful and difficult, breathed through the nausea, and then, instead of dialing my lawyer in a panic or begging for a settlement, I opened a fresh notebook and began writing the names of every person who had ever tried to make me feel small, starting with my mother, then my father, then Adam with his eternal smirk. And as I wrote, I made a promise to myself that this time I would not chase their approval, not defend my dignity like it was up for debate, but build a record so thorough and calm that when the moment came I would not need to shout to be heard. The family group chat turned into a theater where I was the villain, and they were the saviors of the family legacy, and while the cousins played along with heart emojis and passive little jokes about loyalty, Adam leaked to a few mutual friends that there was going to be a reckoning, which would have stung if I had not already learned that the louder someone talks about justice, the more likely they are terrified of the truth. So I did what no one expected and told my lawyer to consent to immediate discovery, to waive every pointless delay, to hand over bank statements, vendor contracts, cap tables, and tax filings, and then I told him to serve a preservation letter on my parents and on Adam, explicitly listing their email accounts and the family chat where they had been rehearsing their story, which landed like a brick, because bravado is easy until someone asks you to put your words under oath. What hurt, and I will not pretend it did not, was watching my mother act delighted in a way I had never seen when I brought her a promotion or a client win, as if finally dragging me into the mud vindicated every holiday argument where she told me I was stubborn and ungrateful. And what hurt almost as much was the way my father played the disappointed patriarch, repeating the line that I had forgotten who helped me, when all he had ever given me was a warning that failure would prove him right. So I let them perform for anyone who would listen and refuse to correct the record in public, because it is one thing to win a shouting match at a barbecue and quite another to sit across from a judge while your text messages are read out loud. My lawyer kept asking why I would not let him file the aggressive motions he knew how to write in his sleep, and I kept telling him that the power I needed was not in a clever paragraph or a flashy press strategy, but in the patience to watch them overreach. And if he was worried I had no plan, I told him there were 2 steps that mattered right now, the first being to accept every audit of my life they thought would embarrass me, and the second being to make a single move that would look small to them and enormous in front of the court. So I dug up the only check my parents had ever written in my direction that could be tied to my business, a petty amount from years ago that I had refused at the time and that my mother had insisted I take as a gesture, and I calculated the interest as if it were a formal note, then cut a cashier's check for the original sum plus the kind of overage that no one could call symbolic, and I mailed it by certified delivery to their lawyer with a short letter stating, in plain language and without theatrics, that this payment constituted final satisfaction of any alleged family contribution to the company, and that receipt should be acknowledged. I cannot explain the relief of doing something that simple and that clean, because while they were rehearsing speeches about how they had built me, I was closing the only door they could plausibly point to. And I knew the moment their counsel signed for that envelope, he would have to advise them that their favorite talking point had just turned into a liability, and if they dared to call it proof I had owed them all along, I would present the original email showing my refusal at the time and the wording where my mother called it a gift, which would allow me to ask, with perfect politeness, when a gift becomes a loan only after you decide your daughter's success bothers you. Meanwhile, because Adam had started using my company name in a sloppy little website declaring a family equity claim, and because trademarks do not care about family melodrama, I had my counsel send a straightforward notice demanding he stop using the mark and pull the domain, which was not fireworks, but felt like justice in miniature, since it forced him to take down the bragging page he had been texting around like a spoiler for a movie he had not actually seen, and the day the registrar suspended the domain, he called 3 times in a row, which I did not answer, and then he sent a message telling me I was cold, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because for once the rules were working in the direction of the person who had followed them. If you are wondering whether I considered reaching out to my parents to ask if we could stop the bleeding, the answer is that I did, and I almost did it, and then I remembered the time my mother told me at Thanksgiving that tough love would make me stronger. And I decided to accept the gift, because nothing builds a spine like being told that your pain is educational, so I stayed silent. I kept delivering documents, and I waited for the assignment notice that would tell us who our judge would be, because while I was not betting on miracles, I was aware of a fact they had not even considered. Namely that civil case assignments in this county had changed rotation after a retirement, and that the likelihood of a particular courtroom increased by a margin that was not fate but math, and that if luck tilted the way I hoped, the person wearing the robe would not be impressed by adults who treat litigation like family gossip with letterhead. The revenge everyone begged me to take right then, shaming them online, calling out the lies, throwing back every cruel thing they had said, was the revenge I refused, because what I wanted was quieter and sharper. Which is why the morning the clerk stamped the docket and the courier confirmed delivery of my cashier's check to their attorney, I sat with my coffee and watched the electronic assignment populate. And when the name appeared under the seal, I put the mug down and felt every muscle in my body go still, because it was not a miracle and it was not a trick, it was exactly the signature I had been waiting for. And I knew before I even called my lawyer that my parents were about to walk into a room where charm would not help them and history would not be on their side. By the time the first wave of motions and discovery requests had been exchanged, the lawsuit was no longer a private matter between my parents and me, but a performance they carried out in front of anyone who would give them an audience. And I began to realize that while I had been bracing myself for the weight of legal fees and depositions, the heavier burden was watching 2 people who raised me turn my life into gossip, twisting my reputation into something cheap enough to pass around at church luncheons or neighborhood gatherings where half-truths sounded better than facts, and while I had spent years teaching myself not to flinch at their favoritism toward Adam, the way they openly portrayed me as a thief who had stolen family money left me with a kind of ache that did not go away when I left the room but followed me home, pressing into my chest until I reminded myself that silence now was not surrender but strategy. The escalation came in waves, with Adam boasting that he was finally getting what was his, and my parents hinting to extended family that they would soon be partial owners of my company, as if a court would magically crown them shareholders because they were offended by my independence, and instead of being embarrassed by their arrogance, they seemed emboldened by it, calling relatives in other states, telling friends of friends that they were protecting the family name, which made me wonder how much of this lawsuit was about money and how much was about the thrill of humiliation, the perverse satisfaction of seeing me dragged down in public after I had spent so many years refusing to bend to their control. There were mornings when I wanted to fire off a statement, to buy a billboard if necessary, to tell the world that my business was clean, that my parents had never given me a cent. that the only money I ever took from them was that small check years ago which I had already repaid with interest. But every time I drafted the words in my head I stopped, because what I wanted was not a viral moment of vindication, but the kind of slow, steady reckoning that comes when your accusers are forced to defend their own lies under oath, and that meant enduring the humiliation now so that when the time came, I would not need to shout to be believed. The irony was that while they were exhausting themselves filing paper after paper, treating the court like a stage for their grievances, I barely had to move a muscle beyond producing records and answering discovery requests, and the more they pushed, the more obvious it became to anyone with legal experience that their claims were bloated, inconsistent, and impossible to sustain, which did not stop them from parading around like victors, but it gave me a kind of grim reassurance, because every additional affidavit and motion they filed was like another brick on their side of the scale, dragging them further down into the mess they had created. At one point, Adam tried to bait me by posting vague insults online, claiming that I had cut corners and that the truth was coming, and while part of me wanted to respond with screenshots of his endless requests for money, his failed ventures, and the drunken messages he had sent me begging for introductions to my clients, I stayed silent, because I understood that silence made him louder, and the louder he became, the less credible he would look when the time came to explain himself in court, and that realization gave me a satisfaction that no public clapback could ever match. Behind the scenes, my lawyer reminded me that lawsuits like this were designed to wear people down, to bleed them of energy until they broke, but I told him that exhaustion was nothing new to me, that I had been surviving the weight of my parents' disapproval for decades, and that this was simply a louder, more expensive version of the same test, and he admitted that while my strategy of restraint was unusual, it was working. Because the longer I let them speak unchecked, the more material they provided for me to dismantle in a single, precise strike. The turning point in this phase was not a dramatic confrontation or a shocking revelation, but a small, procedural notice, the kind of thing that would seem meaningless to anyone else, because it confirmed that the assignment of judges had landed exactly where I hoped it would, which meant that while my parents were puffing themselves up with tales of impending victory, I was quietly carrying the knowledge that the person they would face on the bench had no patience for manipulation, had no interest in being charmed by self-righteous speeches, and most importantly, had history with them that they had clearly forgotten, but that I had not. It was almost surreal to carry that secret, to sit across from them in mediation sessions where they smiled and smirked like they were savoring my downfall, while I nodded politely and let them believe I was cornered. Because the truth was that the walls they thought were closing in on me were in fact rising around them, and the higher they built them, the harder it would be to escape when the time came. I sometimes wondered if I should feel guilty for letting them walk so confidently toward a trap, if I should warn them that they were only hurting themselves, but then I remembered the smirk on Adam's face, the smug tilt of my father's voice, the gleam of satisfaction in my mother's eyes when she whispered to an aunt that I would soon learn my lesson, and the guilt evaporated, replaced by something steadier and sharper, the certainty that they were about to face consequences they had never imagined possible. They thought escalation would wear me down, that humiliation would weaken me, that the endless paperwork would bury me under legal jargon and fees. But what they did not see was that every step they took was leading them closer to a courtroom where their smiles would finally vanish, and as much as I wanted to rush to that day, I knew the most devastating victories are the ones that arrive slowly, after your opponent has convinced themselves that they have already won. As the court date drew closer, the tension in my life shifted from being an abstract storm of filings, phone calls, and whispered rumors to something more tangible, because every conversation seemed to bend back toward the inevitable moment when we would all be forced into the same room, and while my parents seemed to grow more confident the nearer we came to that day, parading their version of events to anyone willing to listen, I grew quieter, almost detached, not because I didn't care but because I understood that the last thing I could afford was to waste energy on emotional theatrics before the stage was set, so I carried myself with a calm that confused even my lawyer, who could not reconcile my silence with the seriousness of the case. My parents, meanwhile, took great pleasure in behaving as though the judgment was already written in their favor, telling relatives that I would be returning what was owed, and joking loudly at family gatherings that soon Adam would finally get to sit at the table as an executive, as if courtrooms operated on favoritism and entitlement rather than law and evidence. And while I should have been furious at their arrogance, what I felt instead was an almost clinical curiosity, because I was beginning to see their behavior less as a personal attack and more as evidence that they were blind to the reality of the situation, unable to grasp that the very judge they were about to face was not only unimpressed by such arrogance, but had lived through enough of their self-righteousness to be immune to it. There were nights I lay awake wondering if my restraint was a form of cowardice, if my refusal to fight on their terms would leave me unprepared, but every time the thought surfaced I reminded myself that I had already done the hard work. I had already repaid the one minor check that could have been used against me. I had already preserved records that would show beyond a doubt that my company was mine alone, and I had already watched them grow careless in their overconfidence, which meant that my silence wasn't avoidance, but strategy, the steady patience of someone who knows that noise is not strength and that sometimes the most devastating blow is the one that comes after your opponent has run out of breath. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Adam called me twice, pretending to want reconciliation, though it was clear from the rehearsed tone of his voice that he was baiting me into saying something that could be twisted. And I responded with the same measured politeness I had used in court filings, short acknowledgments that gave nothing away, because I refused to hand him the soundbite he wanted to parade around the family like a trophy. And I could hear his frustration in the silence that followed each non-committal answer, which only convinced me further that the best revenge was not shouting, but starving them of the drama they so desperately wanted. My lawyer admitted that he had never seen a client so calm before a trial, and while he praised my composure, I could tell he was also unnerved by it, as if he feared I might be suppressing emotions that would explode at the wrong time. But what I could not easily explain to him was that this calm wasn't denial. It was the product of decades of surviving their criticism, the years of being told I was never enough, and the countless moments where I had to bite my tongue just to get through a dinner without causing an argument, and so sitting in silence, holding back, letting them gloat. It was not new to me. It was simply the same old dynamic on a much bigger stage, except this time, I knew that when the silence broke, it would not be my voice but the court's. The night before the trial, I sat alone at my desk, reviewing the binders my lawyer had prepared, not because I doubted their strength, but because I needed the comfort of seeing it all in order, every contract, every bank statement, every affidavit neatly tabbed and ready, and as I flipped through the pages I realized I didn't feel the dread I thought I would, because no matter what came next, I had already survived the hardest part, which was accepting that my parents weren't fighting me because of money, but because they could not stand the idea of me succeeding without them, and there is no legal argument strong enough to disguise that kind of bitterness. I went to bed early, but before I closed my eyes I whispered to myself a simple truth that had carried me this far. Tomorrow I would not need to raise my voice, I would not need to perform, I would not even need to defend myself with passion or outrage, because the weight of their lies would collapse under its own pressure, and all I had to do was sit still long enough to watch it happen. And when the next morning arrived and I walked into that courtroom, I held on to that truth as I took my seat, keeping my eyes steady, breathing evenly, and reminding myself that no matter what they said or how confident they looked, the moment I had been waiting for was already in motion, because when they finally entered the room and their eyes landed on the bench, I saw the exact second recognition struck, and in that instant the smug expressions I had endured for months drained from their faces, leaving something I had not seen in them before, not anger, not superiority, but the first glimmer of fear that maybe, just maybe, this battle would not end the way they had promised the world it would. When the clerk called the case and we all stood, I watched my parents' faces tilt upward with the same expectant pride they wore at graduations where they thought their presence alone conferred legitimacy. And then I saw the moment recognition landed like a weight in their throats as they took in the nameplate and the voice and the unhurried cadence of a judge who had once, years earlier, presided over a neighborhood easement dispute where they had tried to steamroll a retired couple with bluster and half-truths only to be cautioned on the record about misrepresentations and reminded in pointed language that the courtroom is not a living room and that volume does not convert opinion into fact, a memory they had buried until it stood up in a black robe and asked counsel to announce appearances, at which point the manufactured confidence I had been forced to inhale for months began to leak out of them in small, visible ways that no one but me seemed to register, a dropped shoulder here, a tightened mouth there. And I understood that the story they had been telling the family could not survive fresh air. We took our seats and my lawyer began with the quiet clarity I had insisted on all along, stating that I would waive opening theatrics if the court preferred to move directly to evidence, and the judge nodded with the slight irritation of someone who values time. After which my parents' counsel launched into the sweeping narrative they had rehearsed at church and over casseroles, except in this room, every flourish created a new place for the judge to ask for specifics, and when specifics were requested their case began to shrink because the supposed family fund turned out to be a phrase repeated in group chats and holiday toasts, but never reflected in an account with my name on it, and the one check my mother had once insisted I take as a gesture was now not only documented in her own words as a gift, but had been repaid in full with more than market interest by a cashier's check their attorney had signed for weeks earlier, which the judge handled with the kind of professional boredom that devastates people who rely on drama to carry them through thin facts, asking only whether receipt had been acknowledged and whether any other transfers could be identified by date, amount, and originating account. When their lawyer tried to pivot to character, implying that my independence had grown from ingratitude, the judge cut him off with a reminder that character is not currency unless it appears in ledgers, and asked again, for the third time, for hard numbers and bank trails, at which point my father did something he had done my entire life when cornered, namely he attempted to speak over the person asking the question, and the judge's eyes lifted with a calm that said the rules would apply equally to everyone. So my father fell quiet and my mother tried a softer approach about family intent and expectations, and the judge responded with a series of short, clinical questions that dismantled the mythology of a communal purse in less than a page of transcript, because gifts do not, after the fact, become loans because success arrived without permission. And intentions whispered in kitchens do not transform into equity simply because disappointment hardened into resentment. We moved through my records in a steady, unhurried line, vendor by vendor, contract by contract, deposit by deposit, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel since the day the certified letter hit my table, which was the culmination of every quiet choice I had made, from consenting to discovery to refusing to spar in public, because in this room restraint had become proof and noise had become suspicion, and when the judge asked their counsel why a spreadsheet of supposed family contributions included dates that preceded the existence of my company and amounts tied to checks written to Adam after his latest failed venture, there was a pause so heavy I thought I could hear the group chat crumbling one unread message at a time, after which their lawyer mumbled about confusion and overlapping household expenses, and the judge, in the same even tone he had used all morning, asked whether counsel wished to revise any exhibits before they were admitted, which is the kind of question that lands like a warning without needing to raise its voice. At a brief recess their attorney approached mine in the hallway with the wary courtesy of someone who has finally looked at the scoreboard, offering a walk-back that preserved face, something along the lines of a mutual dismissal and a promise to move on. And I could feel my lawyer watching me, ready to follow my lead, and I took my time answering because I wanted the terms to reflect not revenge for sport but accountability written in clean lines, so I said I would agree to dismissal with prejudice so that this performance could not be staged again under a new title, and I would agree to each side bearing its own fees so I could never be accused of profiting from humiliation. But only if they signed a stipulated statement to be filed on the docket and circulated to the very family chat they had used to smear me, declaring in plain language that no family money was invested in my company, that the earlier check had been a gift fully repaid, and that any statements to the contrary were withdrawn, coupled with a mutual non-disparagement clause with real teeth and an acknowledgement that use of my company's name or marks for posturing or pressure would trigger immediate injunctive relief without the need for further warning. They pushed back, as expected, with talk about pride and optics and how it would look, and I, who had been trained since childhood to smooth feelings and keep peace, did not move an inch. Because I was no longer negotiating with my parents as a daughter apologizing for breathing too loudly at the dinner table, but as a woman who had built something brick by brick and would not permit it to be repainted in someone else's colors. And after a long whispering huddle, their counsel returned with a face that looked like defeat dressed as pragmatism and said they would sign, though he asked whether the statement had to go to the family chat, and I told him that when you choose a stage for your accusations, you do not get to pick a closet for your apology. Back on the record, the judge accepted the stipulation, dismissed the action with prejudice, and, in a tone that was neither warm nor cruel, reminded the parties that courts are not tools for settling emotional scores disguised as accounting, and that the next time anyone in this family was tempted to litigate a feeling, they might consider whether a conversation or a therapist would cost less, which landed like both a rebuke and a relief, and then it was done, not with a crescendo or a shout, but with signatures and a gavel and the quiet that follows when a storm finally recognizes it cannot frighten the house it tried to rattle. I did not hug anyone or offer a speech or collect congratulations in the hallway. I walked past my parents without meeting their eyes and past Adam, who could not decide whether to scowl or smile. And I kept moving until I reached the street where the air felt ordinary in the best possible way, and my phone buzzed with the first of many messages as the statement hit the family chat and the spin that had fueled months of drama lost its engine. And although friends would later ask whether I forgave them or whether I planned to patch things up, I answered with the only truth that matters to me now, which is that I no longer need to carry their storyline to prove that mine is real. That sometimes the smartest revenge is to let people file every paper and rehearse every boast until they walk into a room where the rules are the same for everyone and the past can be read aloud without flinching. And that if there is any unfinished business left between us, it no longer resides in my chest. Because the final move was not the judge's history with them or even the dismissal itself, it was my refusal to play the role they wrote for me, and that, more than any sanction or headline or whispered apology, is what turned this from a family feud into a quiet, undeniable win.